Greetings and salutations, fellow book readers. This is Mark, and the book I'll review today is Labyrinths. Before we continue, this is personalized limited edition of Labyrinths with leather cover designed and made by me. At the end of the video, I will tell you a couple of ways of how you can get one for yourself if you are interested. Now let's get back to the review. Labyrinths is a collection of short stories and essays by the Argentine writer Jorge Borges. I think the book was only published in English and is a mix of stories from the two of Borges' most famous short story collections published in Spanish in the 1940s, titled Ficciones and El Alep, plus some essays and reflections. Borges is most famous for his short stories, but he also wrote poetry and essays and was a translator mostly from English. He spoke a few languages, and this allowed him to read many great works in their original. He read anything he could get his hands on, and that's probably where his influences come from, reading the broad variety of literary works. Borges came from a well-educated artistic family. His father wrote a novel, which Borges never accomplished. He also spoke English at home, which contributed to Borges' fluency in it. His mother was a literary translator from English and French, and the sister was a painter and an art critic. Borges is considered by many the greatest Latin American writer, a South American literary titan, but he never won the Nobel. Some people speculate his conservative, right-wing political views contributed to it. It is possible, some say Joseph Conrad never won the Nobel because his literature was too dark, too pessimistic, and didn't contribute to the lifting of the human spirit. So who knows what twisted guidelines the Nobel Commission uses to award their prize. After Obama won it for the things he could do in the future but never did, I think many people became aware of the Nobel's bias and are skeptical about the whole process of selecting the winners. What is Labyrinths about? It is a collection of short stories which take us into an imaginary world created by Borges, a beautiful sample of magical realism so well developed in Latin America. Why does it disturb us that Don Quixote be a reader of the Quixote and Hamlet a spectator of Hamlet? I believe I have found the reason. These inversions suggest that if the characters of a fictional work can be readers or spectators, we as readers or spectators can be fictitious. There are also some of Borges' thoughts in the form of essays on philosophy, religion, politics, and the world in general. A bit of the plot. As I mentioned, Labyrinths is a collection of some of the best of Borges' short stories and reflections in the form of essays and parables. I will review a few of them to give you the idea of Borges' style. The first story is titled Tlon Uqbar Orbis Tertium, and it starts with the line which I found interesting. Mirrors and copulation are abominable because they increase the number of men. The story seems to be some kind of investigation into a mythical or fictitious country, continent, or even planet, somewhat of an Atlantis, and how it interacts with and influences our reality. I found it a bit confusing. The next one, The Garden of the Forking Path, is about a Chinaman somewhat lost physically and psychologically in the West, Europe, in the labyrinth of the streets, which he finds similar to the labyrinths created by a Chinese emperor. The story seems to question identity and loyalty, and it is a bit of clash between the West and the East. Then, Lottery of Babylon, where lottery seems to be a metaphor for life. The more you play, the larger the possibility of winning. There is corruption and theft of tickets, just like in real life people steal the fruits of your labor. There is a governing body which makes rules, supposedly fair to everybody, but in practice they are not. They favor the rich, just like in real life. Circular ruins seems to deal with dreams as part of reality and the possibility of immortality, and further the impossibility of originality in creation. The Library of Babel presents library as its own universe, infinite just like the universe. It contains the entire world where the whole life can be lived and experienced. The hero searches for a book but can't find it, and he arrives at the conclusion that if it is not in the library, it doesn't exist. It couldn't exist. Borges, I imagine, must have spent a large part of his own life in libraries and probably saw them as their own universes. In Death and the Compass, a detective follows through Europe a trail of murdered men who are Jewish. The story seems to hint at a history of anti-Semitism caused by misunderstanding of the Jewish faith. Another one is the three versions of Judas, which gives different interpretations of Judas and his actions. Also, it implies Judas was the reflection of Jesus in human form, imperfect and a sinner, and the story presents crucifixion as a repetitive and never-ending process, probably influenced by Nietzsche's theory of eternal return. The Immortal is about man's never-ending quest for immortality and search for the fountain of youth. It is a reflection on immortality and its meaning to the individual. To be immortal is commonplace. Except for man, all creatures are immortal, for they are ignorant of death. What is divine, terrible, incomprehensible is to know that one is immortal. The story seems to imply that once achieved, immortality can become a curse, comparable to being lost in an infinite labyrinth without a way out. It seems more influence of and reflection on Nietzsche. Deutsches Requiem is a story of a creation of Nazi ideology and the power and influence it held over many individuals. It analyzes the life of a man condemned to death for running a concentration camp. It looks into the hows and the whys of somebody becoming a Nazi. I think we have pretty superficial knowledge and are a bit naive about Nazism. There is still a lot of stigma attached to German fascism, and we feel morally forced to have a one-sided view. We are often guided by hate of what happened and see the Germans during the World War II as evil, fanatical robots. In reality, the story is a lot more complex, going back in the history and reflecting humanity in general. What can happen, how far individuals can go into the dark under specific circumstances. And it is not limited to the Germans. Many of them were convinced that their acts were to save the humanity. Looking at the 18th and 19th century philosophy, we can see that the Germans were deep thinkers, so the answers cannot be so simple. We have given more than our lives. We have sacrificed the destiny of our beloved fatherland. Let others curse and weep. I rejoice in the fact that our destiny completes its circle and is perfect. In general, it is difficult to understand Borges' stories since they are very vague and surreal, and this leaves them to be interpreted in many different ways. The essays in the second half of the book cover a broad range of topics, including the history of literature, the nature of language, and the idea of infinity. And Borges uses examples and references from literature and philosophy to illustrate his points. I found the essays as interesting as the stories, perhaps even more so, because they directly relate to real life and are easier to understand. There is the Argentine writer and tradition, in which Borges analyzes the style and influences of the Argentine literature, specifically poetry, the national identity and importance of Buenos Aires as the background. Borges also admits, against the nationalistic beliefs of many Argentines, that there were many foreign influences, such as French and English, in shaping the Argentine literature. The Wall and the Books looks at the reverse relationship between literary freedom and authoritarian governments, less of one, more of the other, and vice versa. Borges uses the example of the first Chinese emperor who started the Great Wall of China. He erected the wall because walls were defenses. He burned the books because his opposition invoked them to praise the emperors of olden times. Burning books and erecting fortifications is a common task of princesses. Chinese have the tradition of trying to cut themselves from their past, at least the ones in power, in the effort to solidify their grasp on the society, only to realize later, when the consequences start to bite, that it wasn't such a good idea. The latest one was the Cultural Revolution implemented by Mao, which now Xi is trying to modify and diminish, little by little, in order not to offend Mao's fanatics. They, the top echelon of the CCP, are realizing that many of the older traditions, especially the ones relating to the family, kept the society stable and functional. Censoring and destroying people's connection to the past is what all authoritarian governments practice, and it seems to be surfacing in our own backyard. Some politicians are claiming they know better than us what we should read and hear. The latest example is the war in Ukraine, where I found some external news sources, such as Al Jazeera, to be less biased and more competent than our own media outlets in the EU or the US. Of course, the same cannot be said about the war in Gaza. Another story is the fearful sphere of Pascal, where Borges tries to link science and religion, and he argues that God is a sphere, since sphere is portrayed as the perfect shape, infinite, with no beginning nor end. In Kafka and his precursors, Borges goes over Kafka's writings, meaning and symbolism, and he says it is so distinct it can be recognized in any text. Kafka had enormous influence on Borges's writings, and he had an expert knowledge of Kafka's writings. The Mirror of Enigmas argues that everything is reflected in ourselves, or everything in us is reflected in the outer world. The true abyss, which is the soul of man, the terrifying immensity of the firmament's abysses, is an illusion, an external reflection of our own abysses perceived in a mirror. Borges seems to question reality, what is it, and of course there is no one answer, maybe because reality is whatever you want it to be. A new refutation of time is Borges's reflection on time. Does time exist? And if it does exist, how does it relate to the physical world and the individual? He quotes Heraclitus, who said, "You should not go down twice to the same river," which seems to affirm the existence of time, because time is movement. Further, Borges says that every man is the sum of everything that happened in the world, so there is no need to think about general suffering, since we experience all the suffering as individuals. What you can suffer is the maximum that can be suffered on earth. If you die of starvation, you will suffer all the starvation there has been or will be. If 10,000 people die with you, their participation in your lot will not make you be 10,000 times more hungry, nor multiply the time of your agony 10,000 times. Do not let yourself be overcome by the horrible sum of human sufferings. Such a sum does not exist. Borges also asks, how do we see the world? How are the signals that arrive in our brain interpreted? He says that it might be more beneficial to separate the brain from ourselves, and instead of saying "I think," we should say "it thinks." Further down there are some parables which seem to be a form of poetic reflections. What are my thoughts about Labyrinths? It is a great sample of Borges's work and also a view into his thinking processes. The stories at times are confusing and take you in an unexpected direction, similar to wandering inside a labyrinth. Thus the title. There is no need to build a labyrinth when the entire universe is one. Borges challenges our definitions of identity, time, and what we perceive as reality, and makes us question if we understand any of it. It is obvious that Kafka had a great influence on Borges, and he mentions him a few times in the book. We could call Borges the Latin American Kafka, which might be considered an insult to his originality, except that Borges himself admitted that there is no originality in literature. Borges is always quick to confess his sources and borrowings, because for him no one has claim to originality in literature. All writers are more or less faithful amanuenses of the spirit, translators and annotators of pre-existing archetypes. The differences between Kafka and Borges is that Borges never wrote any novels. He knew he couldn't do it and never attempted it. To be fair, Kafka couldn't write novels either. He just didn't want it to accept it. He toiled at it and, psychologically exhausted, would give up before finishing any of them, and in the end wanted all of them to be destroyed. The 3 unfinished manuscripts were edited by Kafka's friend Max Brad and published after his death, against his wishes. There is also Borges's Latin American, or more precisely Argentine identity, important to his writing and somewhat of a paradox. In Argentina, save for the admiration of a relatively small group, he has often been criticized as non-Argentine, as an abstruse dweller in an ivory tower, though his whole work and personality could only have emerged from that peculiar crossroads of the River Plate region. An ivory tower, though his whole work and personality could only have emerged from that peculiar crossroads of the River Plate region. Borges was conservative and probably connected more with the national identity rather than some broad, vague cultural or linguistic concept of Latin America, which is pretty popular within the intellectual and artistic circles in the region. Borges's mother was a large influence on his life and work. He was a bit of mama's boy, not so uncommon in the Latin American culture, spending almost all his life next to her. She almost lived as long as he, dying at 99 years old, 10 years before Borges. As I mentioned before, she was well educated and a translator of the English and French literature, and she had a strong presence and influence on Borges, especially after he became blind. Borges suffered from progressive blindness and became completely blind by the age of 55. I think his struggle with the weak eyesight greatly contributed to his writing style. Initially he found it difficult, but later he said it made him the writer he was. It influenced his imagination and made him create imaginary worlds he could only see. And also blindness taught him how to be visually descriptive, paint with words, because that's how he largely experienced the world. I think his artistic writing style might be responsible for the limited number of English translations, and on top of it not being very good when comparing to the Spanish originals. Perhaps there is something in the absence of Borges's own effort in translating his works into English, even though he was pretty fluent in it. Perhaps he knew he could not do the justice to his work in another language, and it seems nobody else can do it either. I read both the originals and the translations, and there is something missing in the latter. The beauty is not there, and the flow of the prose is different, and this seems to diminish the depth and the impact of the stories. Translations are never as good as the originals, and this is especially true for Borges. Perhaps there are some exceptions, there always are. I read Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness translated into Polish, and I found it better than the original, maybe because Conrad wrote in English but taught in Polish. To sum it up, Labyrinths is a great sample of Borges's work and a fascinating exploration of the human mind, the mental processes, and how they influence our understanding and interactions with the outside world. I think his writings stimulate intellect and, more importantly, imagination in the reader. Time is the substance I am made of. Time is a river which sweeps me along, but I am the river. It is a tiger which destroys me, but I am the tiger. It is a fire which consumes me, but I am the fire. The stories and even the essays make us reflect on what normally we wouldn't think. I would suggest, if you could, you should read them in the original, but the translation is still better than not reading it at all. There are linguistic differences between Spanish and English, and probably there is a reason why one is considered seductive and poetic, and the other pragmatic and direct. Borges can be considered a representative of the Latin American literature, and the best of it, probably together with Gabriel Garcia Marquez. There is a certain sophistication in his writings that I haven't found in any others from that region. Okay, let's talk about the physical book. The book I am holding is a paperback which I transformed into a hardcover leather-bound edition. To make the cover, I use grade A, naturally tan hide. I buy from a tanner in North Spain. It is the same leather Louis Vuitton uses to make his bags, so it is top quality. I do all the processing of the leather myself. First I design the cover, and for this I use this painting of the human brain as a labyrinth, and I thought it reflected the book so well. This is the back with the blurb, and inside the front cover I printed a quote from the book. If you want to see a more detailed video where I explain how I transform paperback into leather-bound hardcover, click on the link in the description. I will make a maximum of 100 editions of each title. Each one will be numbered and initialed, and the numbers will go in chronological order from 2 up, since number 1 stays with me. The price will be around $100, so if you would like me to make one for you, you can click below on my email and send me a message. I do not guarantee I will do it, since it will depend on the time I have available, access to the leather, and if I can get my hands on the copy of the book. Now, if you're not willing to spend the $100 but you still want the book, what you can do is click below on the PayPal link and donate $3 or more to my channel. And for every 100 donations, I will make a lottery and draw one name, and the winner will receive the book. So if you are cheap but feel lucky, this might be the way to do it. Also, your donations give me the extra motivation to make the book reviews, and I appreciate them very much, so thank you in advance. One more thing, when you make your donation, remember to include the title of the book you would like to win. The book itself is beautiful. Visually it has a very nice texture, it smells great, and the more you handle it, the more beautiful it will become. And it makes a great gift for yourself or somebody who appreciates books. So if you want one, don't snooze or you might lose. Well, that's it, so let's end it here, and until next time, keep your ear close to the ground and read a book. Adios.